Yeah, so let's get started. I will stop sharing to see you better, officially welcome everyone, and we will soon start. So we will spend the next 75 minutes together on this soft skills expert session hosted by the CCHN. My name is Maud. I'm a project manager at the CCHN, and I'll be your host for these 75 minutes. So before we start, I'll just want to mention for those who don't know the CCHN who we are. This session is open publicly. So the Center of Competence on Humanitarian Negotiation is a global community of practice that supports humanitarian professionals in developing negotiation skills, particularly for complex and high-stakes environments. And through peer exchange, expert insights, research, and the development of practical tools, the CCHN community of practice helps negotiators worldwide to achieve humanitarian outcomes. Our soft skills expert session brings leading voices in behavioral science, in communication, and in leadership into a dialogue with humanitarian negotiators. And the aim is to explore these soft skills like listening, language, and trust building that are critical in high-pressure negotiation environment. Today's webinar, Word That Opened Doors, uh, Clean Language for Humanitarian Negotiators, will focus on how the words we choose can shape trust, clarity, collaboration, and we will look at practical techniques for using language more intentionally, especially in complex, multilingual, and high-stakes contexts. So this is the first time IMD and CCHN host a webinar together. However, this builds on previous collaboration around some publications. And what brings us together is a shared observation that whether you are a humanitarian negotiator or a senior business leader, soft skills like sense making, listening, and language are essential for creating trust and to navigate charged, complex, and potentially volatile communications. So we are very honored to have you, Heather Cairns-Lee, join us today. You are affiliate professor of leadership at IMD, and your work focuses on leadership development, sense making, and the role of language and metaphors in creating shared understanding. So you have coached leaders worldwide on using language to foster trust and navigate complexity. So please, if you want to say a couple of words to introduce yourself, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be with you today. So, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are coming to join us from. I have long admired the work of the CCHN. I think that you do incredible work in very difficult circumstances. So, if I can give you one or two frameworks or tools that you can add to your toolkit to make you even more effective at what you do, that would be a great delight and make this a great conversation for me today. I don't think there's very much more I want to say other than really I focus on using communication at the intersection of organizations and how we bring about change, how we create inclusive communities and cultures, and how we navigate collaboration together. And so communication for me is the lifeblood that really is the red thread that runs through all of that. And I'm looking forward to a sort of question and answer kind of format that Maud and I are going to engage in. And we hope that you will engage thoroughly. If we pop you into some breakout groups, please feel free to pop answers in the chat so that we can see those and respond to those. So that's it. No further input from me at this stage. Thanks, Maud.
Yeah, thank you so much, Heather. And yes, thanks for also clarifying the format. We have advertised it as a webinar, which might be a little less interactive. And since the topic is so based on practice, we really believe it's a session that will be a lot richer if we can have an interaction. So yes, feel free to interact in the chat and take the floor. So before we dive in, actually, we want to hear from you. We would love to know a bit more about you. And so we will take a moment to launch a poll. You will see that on the screen. And there are three open questions. So the first one is in which country you're currently negotiating. The second one is around what are you negotiating? What kind of negotiation are you running? And here also I want to be open with the term negotiation. It's not only frontline humanitarian negotiations, although I know many of you do are currently negotiating, but also it's around critical discussions that are shaping the sector, maybe or high stakes exchange for you or your organization. So we are very open also with the terminology. And finally, what is for you the role of language in a successful negotiation or critical discussions? So let's take a few minutes to hear from you. Is everyone able to answer the poll? Just checking. If not, you can also answer in the chat.
It's a good idea. If you can't access the poll, pop some of your thoughts in the chat. That would be great.
I see everyone greetings in the chat from all over the world. Let's wait a few more minutes because I see we're about halfway of people answering. And we will visualize those answers in a word cloud. So if you want to put keywords, that will probably also make it more relevant.
Yeah, don't you love a word cloud? I think when we're talking about communication, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but one of the things I find is super helpful is to move away from being, wordivores to actually using visualizations to help manage our communications and make them more accessible for many of us.
Okay, we've got 21 answers in. Let's wait because we're 40 in the call. So and people are joining. If you are joining now, I'm not sure you have the questions from the poll. Do you know, Zoya, if the question appear when people join?
I'm not sure if they appear right away, but if you can't see them, if you go on polls and quizzes in the bottom, you should be able to the window will pop up for you. Oh,
Perfect.
Flavia. Thank you, Flavia.
They do. Great.
Oh, yes. This is the great thing about technology. It's constantly evolving, so we have more and more options. The only downside is we have to find out where those options are so that we know how to use them.
Very true.
So, shall we take a look at what we're seeing on the polls?
Yes, let's have a look.
Give me 1 second.
Julieta, you say, where's the survey? If you click on the three dots at the bottom of, I think on my Zoom at least, I've got three dots that say more on the bottom. And then you go up, there's something that says polls and quizzes. There's a menu of about 10 items, and polls and quizzes is in the middle. I think if you click that, you should be able to see the survey or the poll. Hope that helps.
Okay, so we see where you're all from, and we can definitely identify that we have a broad range of location. A big Ukraine in the center, Syria, Germany also standing out. So yeah, it's very, very rich background, and it's very nice to see all those locations. In terms of what you're negotiating, so access seemed to be standing out with safety, security, protection, health, academic, a combination of things, cooperation, asylum, assessment, programming. Okay.
Gosh, a very diverse set of objectives there in terms of our negotiations.
Yeah, definitely.
And
And
access would be to what? That's a big word. Can somebody potentially come off mute and say what kind of access is that access when you're negotiating access? What kind of access is that access?
I can jump in because it was me who one of the person. So
Oh, great.
access to do. I mean, I work for Doctors Without Borders. So
Fantastic.
access to do our health activities. I mean,
Super.
in very volatile context. Just to
Mm.
summarize.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Augustine. And the question I asked, Augustine, is an example of a clean language question. So I'm just going to mention that. We'll come back to that later. But when we're not sure what we're talking about, what kind of access is that access is a clean language question. And we'll do a little bit of a deep dive into that a bit later. But just to flag that already. Ophelia, you've got your hands raised. Let's hear from you.
Hi everyone, thank you Heather, and thanks for hosting this amazing event. Sorry, this hand was also from the previous question, but maybe I can link it also to the second
Sure.
one. I think it's also I'm working in Berlin right now, humanitarian aid and rescue sector, and it's also sometimes, besides the money, the resources, it's also access to decision makers. Also in the political field, like to know to talk to whom at what time and setting the right agenda. So I've also come across that really access to decision makers has been key lately. Since now budget costs has been really like globally really a pain for a lot of us. So really to find new players on the ground, decision makers. That has been moving me.
Yeah, thank you
Thank
for
you.
that. Very helpful to hear. And of course, having the right person to have the conversation with is a pretty essential element that makes communication effective. So I like very much that you put that on our metaphorical table. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, everyone. And I see the following answers. So, what is the role language? What is the role of language for successful negotiation? So that's interesting in terms of keywords to have that answer in laid out in keywords. So we see language in the very, very middle. And I'm curious, I would actually be curious to hear
Hmm.
more around that.
Hi, good morning.
It's yeah.
Yes. In my case, I am right now in Venezuela that we have a very complicated situation in the country. And obviously, when I put language on my answer, I was referring to how we are going to select the correct words to talk with authorities, because sometimes we as humanitarians, we believe that all people know our mandate or all people know what are we doing or why. And sometimes when you are talking with some kind of
Mhm.
official from governments, they don't have all the information about us. And we should be very careful when we are expressing our ideas, because sometimes we can send a wrong message. In the point is that I mean the language is very important. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying. What else do we see? Important. It is. It seems to be important. Key. Mother. I'm wondering what that means.
Maybe mother tongue.
Probably, yeah. Yeah, if you put two keywords, it separates them. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is a lovely example of an assumption. So I'm seeing mother and I'm assuming mother tongue. And this is a really lovely example of how what we assume often then leads us to ask particular questions or to engage in a conversation in a particular way. And so again, that would be a great example of saying, when mother is a word that's important for this question. What kind of mother is that? Or is there anything else we can know about that mother so that we understand a bit more about it rather than making the assumptions? Because it's normally our assumptions that get us into trouble. And yet we use them all the time, but we don't necessarily realize that we're doing so. So this is a lovely example of an assumption at work.
Yeah, and maybe we can come back to these results as we go through. But that's actually a perfect segue for me to ask you, Heather, so that I don't make assumptions, and, and to ask you actually what inspired you to focus your research and practice on metaphors, language, and sense making, and also in this leadership context. So we would all love to hear from you.
Okay, thank you so much, Maud. So, what inspired me was I've worked in leadership development at IMD Business School for many, many years, almost 30 years. And I would say that my interest stems from when I was working as a coach, when I was working to really understand other people. What I realized was that many people, they came to a place like IMD, not for the latest theories, not for, sometimes they want to meet other people who are practicing in a similar domain to themselves. But actually, one of the most important things they came for was to understand themselves and understand their strengths and their weaknesses of their leadership. And so I became very curious about this question. How do we understand ourselves? And if you think about it, it's one of the oldest um, phrases that humankind has, I would say, which is know thyself. It was an inscription at the Temple of Delphi over 2000 years ago. Know thyself. But how do we do that? Well, one of the ways we can do that is we can ask other people for feedback, and that often happens. We can do some psychometric tests, which compare our results with the norm group of other people. Those are great for giving us a comparison between ourselves and other people. What they're not so good at doing is really helping us to understand how we think and how we take action. And so I started to link two things together. One was a piece of noticing, which is when I noticed how people would describe themselves, they would often describe themselves using a metaphor. A metaphor, of course, is basically at its simplest a way of saying X is Y. Learning is like being a mole digging in the earth in order to come up with something new. Communication is like, for me, a bridge between two people that connects one person and another person. So often people would use a metaphor. And so I became very curious about the metaphors that people were using, and I did a lot of research in it. In fact, I did a master's in leadership and communication, and then I did a PhD in leadership and communication. And what I noticed was that metaphor is actually not a fancy linguistic device that we may have learnt at school. It's actually the basis for how we think. It's the basis for how we make sense of anything that's abstract, anything that's new, anything that's emotional. We are likely to be using a metaphor, which is we draw from one part of our experience, often something that's real and physical and tangible in the world, to describe something that's new or something that's a bit abstract, like negotiation, for example, or like leadership. And so that's how I became interested in helping people to understand more about themselves by if you like, surfacing the metaphors that they have in themselves about all sorts of subjects. So my particular topic was leadership, but it can also be pertaining to communication or negotiation or anything really, because we use metaphor as the basis for how we think. And then I needed an approach to actually ask people about their metaphors without imposing my own thinking on them. So, how can you actually ask someone about something without imposing your own thinking on someone? And that's where I came across clean language, which is a great way of asking questions without your own assumptions, your own words, to really find out more about what the other person is thinking. So that was my interest, and in this world, and I have been working in this area since 2012.
Well, that's fascinating. I'm sure throughout these research and your studies, you have come across so many ways for people to express their vision of the world through metaphors. Um, and you started to describe clean language. So it's a way to speak without imposing your own vision of the world or assumptions. And I'm wondering how does that show up in practical terms, and would that link in negotiation, working in the field where there's a lot of cultural dynamics, power dynamics? How can we start to use clean language?
Thank you. Great question. And I think one of the things that we can do is to really start noticing that actually we are making assumptions most of the time. Why? Assumptions are really our mental shortcuts. To have a brain is to be very fortunate. To have a brain that's working well means that we're going to be making assumptions about how the world works. And that's very normal for us as human beings. We need to be able to do that. And yet they are like the iceberg. If you think of the metaphor of an iceberg, most of our assumptions are below the waterline, so we don't notice them. And yet they influence what we see and how we take action. And so by becoming more aware of the assumptions that we're making, that I would say is the starting point for us to be able to start cleaning up our language, because then we can notice how much our assumptions are influencing the kinds of questions that we ask others. So that would be the first step, I would say, is beginning to notice what our assumptions are, and then we can start to think about how we use clean language in a way that helps to understand others more effectively and more deeply.
And that raises so many questions for me. Like, how can you do that? How to notice? And you said you have come up with ways in your coaching practice to surface the assumption that people are having and the metaphor they're using. And I'm wondering how we could do that alone with our own self.
Well, maybe let me share an image with you. I'm not sure. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes, but
Yes.
not the presenter, not the presentation view. There we go.
Is that what you're seeing now? Do you see a picture of a little rhino?
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
great. Thank you, Ophelia. I love this little image. I think that it's a great little image to have somewhere visible. You can have it as a screensaver. You can have it as a little image that's printed out close to your desk. And it reminds us, as we see, that this little rhino, everything he or she paints has a little tusk in it. And it's a lovely comic way of saying we see things as we are, not necessarily as the world is. So if you want a visual representation, this is a visual representation to remind us that our assumptions basically influence what we see. So that's something that for those of us who are very visual, you might print this out and use this as a little aid memoir. For those of us who perhaps are inspired more by quotations, I would share this. And this is one of my favorite quotes in terms of noticing. Let me read it to you. It says, "The range of what we think and do is limited by what we fail to notice. And because we fail to notice that we fail to notice, there is little we can do to change until we notice how failing to notice shapes our thoughts and deeds. Now, that's quite a wordy quote by R.D. Laing, but what it really says is if we fail to notice, we cannot change. And therefore, what I would say to all of us on this call is beginning to build our skills, our muscle, I think of it as a muscle, of noticing is super important. And that is where the starting point of effective communication happens. It's noticing what are the assumptions that I'm bringing into this conversation. It's noticing the thoughts that we have, the images that we have, because they actually frame our reality in a way that we don't actually notice. So beginning to notice is absolutely essential. Let me stop sharing and just see if there's any thoughts or questions about that, and then we can move on a little bit.
Yeah, and I see there were comments in the chat. I don't know, Zoya and Paula, if there were questions or they're just comments.
So I'm just reading Nazreen. Clean language comes from the belief that the words we choose can either open doors or close them. Absolutely. Clear, neutral, and empathetic communication is essential in humanitarian negotiation, and that can strengthen collaboration and principled decision making. Absolutely right on, Nazreen. And we will talk a little bit more about that and some of the principles to clean up our language so that we can be even more effective as negotiators. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And would you like to say more about that, Heather?
Absolutely. So again, let me share my screen. I prefer to share kind of selectively rather than, overwhelm us all with loads and loads of slides, etc. Can you see that?
Yes, clean language.
Great, there we go. So that's really clean language. What is it? It's a deceptively simple method for asking questions and for listening without interpretations or suggestions. Now, if you think back to that little rhino that we saw, or the quote on failing to notice, why I say it's deceptively simple is that it looks super simple on paper. It's a little bit like, this is a metaphor, it's a little bit like looking at a swan gently gliding across the surface. We see no effort in a swan, but actually under the waterline, they're pedaling like crazy. And therefore, it requires practice for us to be able to be more adept at doing this. It's based on a very, very tiny number of questions, and they're very tiny and simple questions. And I'll give you some examples of those that you can effectively tuck into your back pocket and start using and sprinkling into your conversations and using them in your negotiations, practicing them at the dinner table with your loved ones, your children, your spouses, your partners, so that you can just see what happens when you use them. And they are really helpful for all sorts of different situations, very helpful in coaching, very helpful in conflict resolution, very helpful if you're trying to come up with a new strategy or vision, very helpful for unearthing team dynamics or change management, etc. And they are based on four key principles, really. Clean language is really based on asking clean questions, attention to metaphor, the focus, the need to pay attention, and modeling. And we can talk a little bit about those four elements so that we get a sense of those. But perhaps let's start with this. Tell me, what do you see on the screen? And you'll have to come off mute because all I can see is what I've got on the screen. So pop in the chat, come off mute, so that we get a sense of what you see. There's no right, there's no wrong. It's just we're just interested to see what you see on the screen. You see a face. Thank you,
You see a
Juliet.
face,
Many
yeah.
people. Yeah.
I see a face also.
You see a face. Great, great. Okay, what else do we see? A man with
A man with
glasses.
glasses.
Absolutely, a face, a man with glasses.
Somehow a worrisome face expression.
A
Yeah, a
liar.
bit of a worrisome facial expression. Yeah, absolutely. And Sophia says text. And Liz, you're saying liar. Great. So now look, have a look again, everybody. Maybe twist your head a little bit to the side and look from the top right, and you see like a capital squirrely L, and then joined together I-A-R. Can you see that? I'm just
Absolutely.
pausing because I'm not quite sure. So exactly, yes. So when we first look, some of us just see a face. We go, oh, that's a kind of looks maybe to me like a man's face. Maybe they're wearing glasses. I can see his nose and his mouth. Okay, great. And a bit of a neckline. So, okay, great. Heather, why are you asking us this question? It's kind of obvious. Aha. And then we have another look again. And we see the word liar, or maybe you saw the word liar first, and then you had to look for the face. The point that I would love to make with this simple illustration is the power of questions. I see one thing, maybe somebody else sees something else, and a question is a fantastic way of engaging the brain. What else do questions do? Let's just hear in the chat or come off mute. What are some of the things that just a question does, let alone clean questions? Let's hear from you. Build rapport, absolutely. Sophia, why do they build rapport? Tell us why.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect.
Perfect, thank you. I think it's you're giving space to someone to open up, to express themselves. So basically, you're witnessing them. You're actually acknowledge their presence somehow when you give space to the response as well.
Beautiful, beautiful. Absolutely. You build rapport, you give space, you show curiosity, don't you? It's like saying, wow, I'm interested in enough in you to ask you a question. Fantastic. What else do questions do? Got something there? Yeah, if you use the right words, that creates openness for trust. Absolutely. Marco. Hello, Marco. But questions are like a superpower. Exactly. I love that comment that you make. I am Sarah Selan. I'm not sure if I'm saying your name correctly. It helps us to deal with our assumptions. When we ask questions, it's a way of checking in with our assumptions. And so not only does it show curiosity, it helps us build rapport. It also helps us to check and validate our assumptions. So questions are really, really an important element. And clean language questions are particularly are a particular form of questions. And really, the purpose of asking a clean language questions is that they leave people free to answer from their own world, from their own personal vocabulary, their lexicon, from their way of experiencing the world without superimposing your assumptions, your metaphors, your presupposed answers. And what's helpful about that is that when you ask a question that cleanly, you acknowledge somebody else's experience exactly as they describe it. And that is good for our souls when we have our experience acknowledged exactly as we feel it, as we describe it. That is very, very helpful. And then what happens is that we can, with the clean language question, you can direct attention to the inner world and send person on a quest for finding out some more knowledge. And the other thing is clean language questions often give access to information that was previously unconscious. Now, I've said before they're deceptively simple because they're very easy to ask. And there's a lovely quote by the founder of Clean Language, who was a New Zealand counseling therapist, and he said, "The questions are simple because people are complex enough." If you, I remember something valuable from today, I hope you might remember that quote. The questions are simple because people are complex enough. So I'm going to stop sharing and see what questions we have at this moment.
Yeah, one question that I have is what maybe some of the qualities of a clean question versus a regular questions.
Yeah, so the regular questions, we can ask open questions, we can ask closed questions. Many of us have been taught to differentiate between those kinds of questions. But a clean question is really, we use a clean question with the precise words of the person that we're talking to. So we acknowledge the precise words of the person that we're talking to, and then we add on a very simple question. So as the example from earlier, mother. And that's mother like what? Or what kind of mother is that mother? So very simple lexicon, but it actually helps us to check out our assumptions, which means that we're going to get a better understanding of the two people in the conversation.
Very interesting. So listening is the first step in asking clean question.
Exactly. It's very much the clean approach to asking questions is exactly that, is asking exquisite listening, not paraphrasing. And this might sound different from some of the things you've heard before, is that paraphrasing, if I use a metaphor, is to say, I'm hearing what you say from your world. I'm going to drag it onto my map of the world and how I see it, put it into my own words so that I understand it. That's one way of doing things. Another way of doing things is to say exactly what the other person has said and to repeat that in a tone of great curiosity, and then potentially to add a question on the end of it so that it helps us to understand their world a little bit better without changing it to suit us.
Exact same words and adding the question to hear more. Very interesting. And there's a question in the chat from Nazreen. So, how can clean language help negotiate with actors who hold significantly more power, such as armed groups or government authorities?
Yeah, thank you. That's clearly a very challenging situation to find yourself in, and a very important question. And one of the things I would say is that clean language does help negotiate with these kinds of people that you're describing, Nazreen, because when we're asking clean language, what we're aiming to do is ask questions, not so much of the person, but of the way they're talking. And so you're really having a conversation language to language, and that brings the human dimension onto more of an equal footing. So you're really focusing on asking questions that help to equalize the power base in the conversation. And there's a chapter in the book that I co-edited on how you use clean language in conflict zones. And part of it is to create a sense of neutrality, just based on what I've said, is by really paying exquisite attention to how people express themselves and giving people the feeling of being really heard in their way of expressing. It actually helps them to feel heard, and that they don't have to push an agenda, but that they're more receptive to actually coming up with a shared and co-created solution. And that's what we have seen when using clean language in conflict zones or in great power imbalances.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Nazreen, and for this very interesting answer. And that leads to another question for me, is because I know that these questions in clean language and clean question can help to lower the pressure on the side of the counterpart, but there's also a pressure and a stress that's on the side of the negotiator. So in field negotiation, when time pressure force quick responses, I'm wondering how can practitioners create a space for them to make sense and to be in this listening mode.
Yeah, so when we want to be more in a listening mode, one of the things I would link to is based on what I said around noticing. What are we noticing in the conversation in terms of managing the conversation? And one of the things that we don't notice very often are the metaphors that people use. And this is the second principle of clean language. And I'd love to perhaps just highlight why it is so important for us to do this. So let me share my screen and let me talk for just a few minutes about the importance of metaphor, because this is one of the things that we do not notice in many of our conversations. As I said before, metaphors are the basis for our thinking. They influence, therefore, how we make sense of the world, how we frame situations, and therefore how we take action. But because most people are unaware of their metaphors and their possible consequences, this can be problematic in any form of communication, and particularly when the stakes are high, as in the situations that you're talking about. And metaphors are a key to an individual's inner world and a bridge, I would say, between conscious thought that we're aware of and unconscious thought that we're much less aware of. So how can we begin to notice the unconscious elements that are influencing the way that we think? Let me just give you a couple of highlights about metaphor. As I say, they're like the proverbial iceberg. They are the way of thinking long, long, long before they are a way of words. So beginning to pay attention to the metaphors you use, the metaphors that other people use, gives you, if you like, access to how people are thinking and framing a situation. And that's very important for addressing some of the comments that you have. How do we equalize the way that we show up in a conversation in a humanitarian negotiation? Because metaphors are unconscious and they're part of our thinking process, they actually structure the way we think and they shape the understanding that we have of particular situations. And interestingly, metaphors are a little bit mischievous. They're magical in many ways because they give us access to how somebody thinks, but they're a bit mischievous in other ways because we often look at the one part of the metaphor, but we forget the rest. And this is perhaps shocking for many of you. We use, on average, 4 to 6 metaphors a minute. Not a day, not a week, but a minute. That's one metaphor for every 10 to 25 words. Now, we found these from research across different cultures, across different contexts. And so this is one of the ways that you can start to pay attention to the way that you are perhaps not noticing what's happening in some of the negotiations that you're involved in. That means that metaphors aren't optional, they're inevitable. What is optional is that if you start paying deliberate attention to the metaphors you use or the metaphors of the people with whom you're negotiating. And because of the fact that they're inevitable, they define our everyday realities. So let's just look at an example. This is an example based on research, and the researchers said, look, let's see what difference a metaphor makes. So they said, if we describe crime as a virus or crime as a beast, does it make a difference? And so the research project described crime in this term as a virus. Crime as a virus infecting the city of Addison. The crime rate in the once peaceful city has steadily increased over the past 3 years. In fact, these days, it seems that crime is plaguing every neighborhood. Notice virus, infecting, increased plaguing. Then they described crime as a wild beast. This little fox doesn't look very wild, but it was an image that I chose. And they said crime is a wild beast preying on the city of Addison. The crime rate in this once peaceful city has increased over the past 3 years. In fact, these days it seems that crime is lurking in every neighborhood. As you can see, the first and the last sentence are different. The middle sentence is the same. So what impact does this have? This is the impact that this has. If you look on the left-hand side and we talk about crime as a virus, we see this as being caused by our physical environment, and therefore that impacts our social environment. How are we going to address this? We diagnose the situation, and this leads to needing social reform, which means we're going to educate people, and then we're going to put some money into the economy to ensure that we have a more safe social environment. If on the other side hand you look at crime as a beast, we think of that as an individual aggressor, and therefore it's caused by individuals. In which case, how are we going to address this? We want to hunt and cage the individual aggressors. That means that how we address that is through stricter law enforcement, more police on the streets, and putting people in prisons. All we've done is to simply change the metaphor, virus or beast. But because metaphors are part of our cognition, what we find is they set up these automatic assumptions, and that leads to us framing a situation differently and therefore thinking about different kinds of outcomes. Now, what difference could that make if you were to frame your negotiation with one metaphor or with another? It makes a huge difference. And this is part of the noticing that I was talking about earlier, that we need to do much more consciously to be able to see how we're framing certain situations. If I give you one other example, more related to business in some ways, if we think about introducing a game as the Wall Street or the community game, we get very different kinds of behavior. When we frame it as Wall Street, people think selfish, Wolf on Wall Street, aggressive, individualistic, and people play the game like that. When we think of community, we think of togetherness, collaboration, looking out for each other, and people who have the game introduced to them like that are going to demonstrate those characteristics. So the language we use matters. The metaphors we use are often invisible to us, and yet being more deliberate about understanding where they come from and which ones we use has an impact on how we can actually start noticing the way that we are unconsciously framing our negotiations, and the people we're talking with are perhaps framing their negotiation. Let me stop there and see what comments, questions we have about that.
Yeah, there was a couple of questions in the chat. Maybe they are from a bit earlier, but I think they can still be interesting. I think it's fascinating to see the chain of thought that happens from a word, from the thought, and all the response that happens from that. Very fascinating. Yeah, so I don't know if you want to have a look. There was the question earlier from Nazreen: how does clean language support maintaining humanitarian principles, neutrality, impartiality, and independence during sensitive conversations? That was a little bit earlier, though, before you presented your latest slides. There was a question also from Samuel: clean language can support mutual understanding and negotiation. It's more of a comment.
I like your comment very much, Samuel, because it really acknowledges the social soup in which we're swimming, and this is where it comes back to this idea of kind of noticing what are the assumptions that we make. And I'm going to share with you 5 key short clean language questions that you can actually start using that help us to keep our language as clean as possible by really adding those very short questions to the words that other people use. And that helps us to create this lovely sense of neutrality in a conversation.
Sam Sherman has a very interesting challenge for you. He's asking if you could use a metaphor to tell us how to use metaphors, to tell us how metaphors make a difference.
Yeah, so the examples I've just given are both metaphors. So crime as a virus or crime as a beast. Those are exactly examples of how one metaphor will lead to a certain train of thought, and one metaphor will lead to a very different train of thought. Do you have something else in your mind that you're thinking about, Samuel? Or Sam, sorry.
Um, are you talking to me? I mean,
Yes, Sam
okay,
Sherman.
okay. Let me say that. For example, I'm from the perspective of mass atrocity, prevention of mass atrocity, right? Using this kind of dehumanizing, associating something, crime, individual human committed by human to some kind of animals, right? For me, like this has implication of dehumanization for my interpretation, right? For my background and my
Yes.
expertise. So I would go and say, oh, this kind of framing or metaphor can produce, even can put human in a very dangerous context. Uh, I mean, the metaphor, using this metaphor, if you are coming from different perspective, you have different kind of message and interpretation. So,
Yeah.
what is your take on this?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So the metaphors we use are often culturally based.
Yeah.
So for example, I give you an example. I'm an English woman by origin. So English by origin, Swiss by choice, so a double national. I do not understand American metaphors. So if you say to me, that's a slam dunk, which is an expression and a metaphor that I hear very often from American colleagues, I have no idea. Does that mean it went in the net and it was really good? Or does it mean, because dunk in English is not a particularly fruitful word, does it mean that you messed up? So it's a great example for me of like how on earth am I supposed to understand the cultural context? And we all have those examples. I use metaphors just as everybody else all the time, and yet I unless I'm a little bit more aware of what I'm using, then I may be actually leading people astray, so to speak. So I think that's an example of how we need to be aware, as some of you are saying in the chat, about A, more conscious of the metaphors we're using, and B, to be more intentional about the metaphors that we use. And so I would love to give you a little opportunity to practice, perhaps by, why don't we have perhaps 10 minutes or so in a breakout group, because what I would love you to do is to think about when you are negotiating at your best, you're like what? So when you are negotiating at your best, you're like what? Now that question is a clean language question. You're like what? And what it does is it invites a metaphor. And we could potentially see what kinds of metaphors we have for you as a collective in terms of negotiating at your best. So if you were to go into a breakout group, and I'm going to share, I'm going to put this in the chat. I'm going to take a screenshot of a slide, and I'm going to put this in the chat and say, if you're negotiating at your best, you are like what? And that's a way for you to begin to ask each other a couple of questions. Can I add that to the chat? Yes, that looks like it's gone. So you should have something in the chat that says when you're negotiating at your best, You're like what? And I'd like you to go into a breakout, ideally 3 people in a breakout group. If you've got a few more, then you may need to use the time a bit differently. But just one person ask somebody else, so you can have the negotiator, that's you and your role, have a partner who's going to ask you a couple of clean language questions, and maybe an observer. But just ask, when you're negotiating at your best, you're like what? And then just ask the other person, use the exact words of the other person, and just ask 2 or 3 very clean language questions. Is there anything else about that? Or what kind of? Those would be probably the 2 questions I would ask. And why don't you have an opportunity to practice so that we see and we surface the kinds of metaphors that exist in this group for you as negotiators. And then when we come back, we'll hear what kinds of metaphors you have, and then we can take some questions from you. How does that sound?
Rooms now, if everybody is.
Hello, welcome back. Lovely to see you. Very curious to hear how you got on. So 2 things. Let's see if we can multitask a little bit. If you came up with a metaphor, maybe you can pop those in the chat. That would be fantastic. We get to see what kind of lovely metaphors we have. So please just pop them in the chat, and we'll see what we've got. And then it would be lovely to hear from a couple of you about your experience. So who would be willing to kick us off? Oh, Augustine negotiates as a lion. Fantastic.
Not me, but the negotiator. I was the partner, so it was a negotiator.
Okay, a lion.
The negotiator.
Okay, now that's an interesting metaphor. Being on the receiving end of a lion might make me a little scared. Sophia, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, just to respond to your question, because we had an interesting take. I said that when I'm negotiating at my best, I am August C, which
You
is
are?
August C, the C of August, of the month of August, which is very ambiguous when you hear it, because not everyone has experience of a C. And me coming from Greece, we have this a lot. So as an element, for me, it represents, because I was asked later on about questions. I don't know if you can hear me. Yeah?
Perfect.
Okay, because we had some connection issue. So for me, it's actually, it's quite calm and refreshing if the negotiation goes well. But at the same time, it's also very powerful as an element in whole. So it contains a lot of different elements, but they are a more holistic approach. You cannot have just one character throughout a negotiation. You cannot have just one approach, depending on who you're negotiating with, who is the stakeholder. But the most interesting was Yosra's take, that she had a completely different understanding, which highlights what you said about culture, background, etc. So if you want, Yosra, you can say your take on that.
Hi, my name is Isra. I'm from Sudan. When she said the Sea of August, because for us in August we used to have the flood, so it's been like she will be controlled by her emotion or having the angry things. Then I said like for that reason I prefer to someone who give and receive. When we ask like. What do you mean exactly by the Sea of August? Is it exactly as I mean or something else?
Okay. So it's great. Different interpretations of something based on your cultural heritage. And that's where it's great to see what kind of sea is that? That's a very simple, clean language question that you can use to actually find out more without bringing in your own interpretations. Sarah Selan, is that how I say your name?
No,
No.
but I'm so used to it, and I really like it. So it's Sarah Jaylan, and it's kind of difficult, I know, but I'm
Sarah,
so
say that.
used to being
Okay.
called Sarah. I would look anyways.
Thank you.
So that was a very interesting actual exercise. I'm very familiar with the coaching methods, but I haven't used the metaphors like that before.
Right.
And very interestingly, it really brings out the subconscious, because when my colleague asked me to define my, negotiation attitude with a metaphor, I immediately said also the lion.
Aha, okay.
And I said a hunting lion or something, no, a fierce lion. And I was kind of, that is very weird because, normally I wouldn't think of something like that, but it just kind of burst out of me.
Right.
And then when she continued with the following question, I said, it's a fierce lion who goes up, who tries to bring food to its cubs. So, and it really made sense. And then I started probably from, subconsciously, neocortex started to work on this feedback. And I said, well, that is not really the best way to negotiate.
Right.
So it made me go beyond the metaphor to reach a level of, analyzing my own stance.
Fantastic.
Which was I really enjoyed it. And it's very, very nice. Very nice.
Well, that's music metaphorically to my
to your ears, exactly.
Thank you for sharing that example. That's absolutely lovely, and that's really the purpose. And I'm going to share my screen because I know we're coming to the end of our time together, which I can't believe already. But let me just share my screen. I can't see where's the little arrow gone? There we go. Because I would love to follow up on what you've just said, Sarah Serhan. So this is something that you can do to follow up. You can think about your metaphor for negotiation, and these are some that I've worked with other people on. And what I've asked them to do is exactly what you've just talked about, to think about it, and then to draw it. And you can see here we've got the metaphor of a chess game. You're playing black and white, you're playing chess. We've got the metaphor of going under the surface, under the sea, to find out what are the interests and wants and desires of people. You've got the metaphor of negotiation as a dance. Now, dance is really highlighting connection. You've got the metaphor of somebody as a snake charmer. I mean, think about all those very different metaphors. So what I would love to encourage you to do is think about your metaphor a little bit more. Ask yourself some questions. What kind of snake would that be? Or what kind of sea would that be? Or what kind of bridge would that be? Whatever your metaphor was. And then maybe draw it, because you often find that we see more when we take a distance because we put things onto paper. So that's one very tangible thing you can do to follow up. And then another very tangible thing, and we'll share this with you after our talk, is 5 clean language questions that you can ask in any negotiation. You can practice at your dinner table to really help move the conversation forward in a clean and neutral way. And you can see the 5 questions on the left and why they're really helpful on the right. So what would you like to have happen in our conversation, in our negotiation? It invites people to think about a desired outcome in a neutral manner. And then please use this question. This is probably my most used question of all time. And to say, and is there anything else about ... There usually is. And if there isn't, someone will just say, actually, no. But most of us could benefit from asking that question, because there's usually something else on people's minds. We've talked a little bit about this question. And that's like what? If you're talking about something that's abstract, difficult, it converts it to a metaphor, and sometimes that can be easier to talk about. And then if you're wanting to find out a bit more about how somebody else sees the world, you say, and what kind of negotiation is that? Or what kind of lion is that? Whatever. You find out more about what's on somebody's mind. And then the final question is, and how do you know? That really gets people to think for themselves. Gosh, how do I know what I know? So I hope that will be helpful in terms of something very tangible to think about your metaphor, 5 questions to facilitate negotiations. And then the other thing is just How do you do this in practice? Of course, part of it is not just the questions, but the way we ask the questions. So it starts, as Maud said, with exquisite listening, often using the word and, say, and blah, blah, blah. You repeat exactly what somebody says. It slows down the conversation. And the other thing is just sometimes just saying and repeating what somebody has said is enough for them to actually be able to say some more or find or connect more with what you're saying. So let me stop sharing there. I'm happy to share my contact details again afterwards, but I know we're coming up to the end of our time together, and I want to make sure we've got a moment to close our time together.
Yeah, thank you so much, Heather, for all that you've shared in such a short amount of time. Thank you for taking the time. I know you have a very busy schedule, for coming to the CCHN and sharing your experience and your knowledge. Thanks also for being this bridge between different worlds, the business world, the leadership world, and the humanitarian and negotiation world. And I hope participants, thank you so much for also coming, sharing, participating. And I hope you can also, through this session, realize well, we've realized how much there's in common between those different sectors, and maybe not at the strategic negotiation level, but at the human and skill and behavioral and communicational level, definitely. So we also hope at CCHN to bring you more of experts like Heather for further sessions. We'll keep you posted. And so one takeaway for me really is this power of just words, just one word, how it can shift uh, the entire chain of thought and consequences and implication after a conversation. And Heather, I actually would like to leave you the final word to close this session, but I wanted to really thank you for your time and your valuable content.
Oh, thank you so much, Maud. I've really appreciated the time to be with you. I think you do really important work. And if you can perhaps start noticing the assumptions that you're bringing to your negotiations, if you can start noticing the assumptions that your interlocutors bring to the negotiations by being really attentive to the words and particularly the metaphors that people use, I hope that will give you even more ability to negotiate effectively for the incredible causes that you do. And remember, sometimes the questions are really complicated, but the answers are simple. And that's why in clean language, we use really simple questions added to the person's actual words to just find out more about their world, the way they're seeing things, as a way to create that bridge of understanding between them and us in order to come to better outcomes.
Thanks a million, Heather. And we will send all of you a follow-up email with some of the slides, contact details, resources as well of publications we have created together between CCHN and IMD and Heather including. And yeah, I think thank you so much. For those who want to stay, I will still have a moment to stay around. I don't know, Heather, I know you have a busy schedule.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I'm absolutely happy to stay for 5 minutes.
For those who have to leave, thank you so much. Wishing you a great continuation of your day and looking forward to see you again in another CCHN event soon.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.